migration options one more time. Within session number 2, my colleague Alexander has been using the Migration Assistant tool in order to transfer an SG configuration into a supported XG backup format. Within today's session, I will be using this migrated backup so I can walk you through the post-migration tasks and optimizations that can be done. By doing so, you have an inline process of the migration job itself, which is session number 2, as well as the post-migration optimizations based on the identical configuration. In case you should be struggling at some point in time to migrate a configuration from SG to XG, as a partner, you can always contact the Sophos migration desk, which will assist you in performing this migration task. They also have the options to migrate parameters of other configurations, so it's always worth considering to contact this team.
এটা হচ্ছে সংক্ষিপ্ত নেম অ্যাডমিনিস্ট্রেশনকে সংক্ষেপে এডিএম বলা হয়, অ্যাকাউন্টসকে সংক্ষেপে বলা হয় এসিসি, ফাইন্যান্স ডিপার্টমেন্ট।
কিন্তু এখানে আপনার মনে করেন যে গ্রুপ শেয়ারে এইরকম থাকবে, তাই তো?
হ্যাঁ
এসিসি
ওইভাবে থাকবে। এফআইএন মানে এফআইএন দ্যাট মিনস ফাইন্যান্স ডিপার্টমেন্ট, সংক্ষিপ্ত আকারে প্রথম 3 ক্যাপিটাল লেটার।
কিন্তু এখন এই গ্রুপের নামের আগে বুঝছেন এই যে এইগুলো ধরেন যে এটা গ্রুপের নাম হবে, তাই না? এটা কিন্তু ফাইলেরও নাম হবে, তাই না? এই যে আমার যে গ্রুপ সে
ফাইল বলতে
ইউজারের কাছে যে ডিপার্টমেন্ট, ঠিক আছে,
ফাইন্যান্স ডিপার্টমেন্ট
ওই সে নাম কি ইউজারের কাছে যে ফাইলটা যাবে, হ্যাঁ
all XG firewalls connected to that management instance. So in several cases, it might be a useful idea to consider object deployment via central firewall management, as those objects can easily be reused and deployed to multiple firewalls. However, let's focus on the post-migration options. So first of all, it's worth mentioning that UTM required. Even though it is possible to migrate IPsec VPN tunnels as long as they are pre-shared key or RSA key related, it's still worth considering if you do not want to take advantage of the route-based VPN option that is provided by the XG firewall as well. Sophos Red VPN as well as our access point devices are both dependent to certificate-related information and therefore cannot be migrated using the migration assistant. We recommend to prepare your XG firewall in order to accept access point or red device registration and afterwards to migrate them one by one. As mentioned earlier, Sophos Central provides you with a free of charge management instance for your XG firewall systems. This is a quite useful tool in order to assist you in a migration job as well as to ensure an identical security policy over all your XG firewall devices. So, before switching into the virtual environment, I would like to summarize the post-migration recommendations one more time. The steps listed here are also the configuration changes that we will be applying in our virtual environment in order to ensure we can take most advantage of the protection offered by XG Firewall. So in general, we will be uploading the migrated configuration that was based on an SG firewall. We're going to review the config parameters that are applied to the XG firewall, as well as we will optimize them in order to reflect the XG-based zone logic, as well as we will be implementing, for example, authentication services. As mentioned already, XG Firewall comes with support for route-based as well as policy-based VPN, while our SG is supporting policy-based VPN only. So even though route-based VPN gives you the more flexible VPN implementation, we will be remaining on policy-based VPN for this webinar, as route-based VPN will be covered in other sessions. As mentioned before as well, RED and access point migration is not an automated process. I will be therefore preparing the XG firewall in order to accept access points or RED device registration, and I will be explaining the best practice when approaching this task. Last but not least, we will be connecting our XG firewall to Sophos Central, as this gives us multiple advantages in regards to security, as well as I can demonstrate the centralized deployment using Sophos Central. So without further ado, let's switch over into the live demonstration. So as you can see, I've now connected to the demo environment, and I'm currently connected to a Windows 10 client system that does not have an internet connection. The client system is directly connected to this XG firewall, which is currently in an unconfigured state, which is also the reason why I cannot access the internet anymore. Kindly note that the XG is currently listening on IP address 10.10.10.6, which is a temporary IP address for the deployment task. So, as mentioned, the XG is unconfigured. It was basically registered in order to create a license sync, as well as I removed the default firewall policies that are in place typically. And we will now be uploading the migrated SG configuration in order to apply our old configuration from that SG firewall. So if we take a look over here, there's the migrated configuration backup in place, and we can upload it via the regular backup restore functionality of the web app. So let's select this and start the upload in order to apply the configuration. Kindly note that the IP address will be changed according to the SG configuration that was in place before, which is also something that the web admin does inform us about. So I'm starting the upload process right now. This typically will take up to 10 minutes to apply this type of configuration, and afterwards we can access the firewall via the productive IP address in order to adjust the configuration further on. As we can see, the backup import has been successful, as the web UI of the XG firewall is not responding anymore to the old IP address. Kindly also notice that this client system now has an active internet connection, indicating that there are policies in place allowing this kind of communication. Let's try to access the XG firewall via the new productive IP address, which is 10.10.10.20. After the successful authentication, the dashboard is already indicating that there is communication being allowed and forwarded. It also gives us information about currently active firewall policies, which were migrated via the backup report. We can also see that there's some kind of VPN configuration in this. So this part of the migration has been successful. Let's access the rules and policies section in order to review and optimize our current firewall policies. By reviewing the rules and policies section, we can actually verify if all firewall rules have been migrated successfully. This is the case in this scenario. We should now adjust the policies in order to reflect the zone-based logic. We should give them descriptive naming and probably group them in order to match a more structured rule set. So let's edit the first one. This is currently a DMZ network, so we give it a name, DMZ to WAN, and we leave the network information in there so we can understand to which networks they apply. Let's assign the zones accordingly. DMZ to WAN configuration in this case. And we will also group it so we can assign other policies that apply to the DMZ zone here as well. DMZ rules are typically network-based rules, so we will adjust that here accordingly so the system can perform the auto-assignment of new policies that are created correct. So the first rule has already been adjusted. We can also notice that there is a dedicated NUT rule assigned to this policy, which we're going to verify shortly after we have optimized the remaining rules. The second policy here is also applied to the DMZ zone. So we will name it accordingly just for the different network elements. We repeat the process of assigning the correct zones. This is of course not mandatory. It, however, is a helpful feature in order to reduce the amount of rules that you have, as well as to apply the XG logic in the future. So I would suggest to stick to the zone-based concept when deploying XG firewalls. Again, there's a dedicated NAT policy assigned, no security. This is done later on. So, as mentioned, the two policies for the DMZ to WAN access are now located in this group, and I will put it on the bottom so it does not interfere with our other configuration. Actually, I will also remove this firewall policy as it is not needed in my environment, so you should also alter and verify the rules for logic when performing such a migration. Not any rule that is able to be migrated from an SG firewall is also required in an XG firewall. For the further process of this demonstration, I will be using this rule as it applies to the LAN network. And this will be our example rule on which we apply then further security parameters, authentication, web protection, as well as application control, for example. So again, we gave it a descriptive name. As there's a single rule, I will not assign it to the group. However, I will of course be assigning the zones as needed, as well as I will adjust it to certain services which I will allow for the internet communication here. So this is based on the SG configuration, which applied, as it seems, in any rule to the internet access. In our case, we will reduce that a little bit so we can ensure that only required services are allowed to connect to the public network. Again, there's a dedicated NAT rule in place, and this is exactly the section that we're going to verify in the next step. So this looks already like a more XG style configuration. Let's move over to the NAT policy. And as you can see, the system is indicating here that there are masquerading rules that are bound to firewall policies. So each of these firewall rules is bound to a particular, of these NAT policies is bound to a particular firewall rule. However, there's also a default NAT policy in place which actually performs the same translation as the other policies. You can see that here. This policy basically translates FTP traffic when accessing the internet to the public WAN IP address. So whenever there's FTP traffic reaching public networks, it will use the masquerading. Verifying those policies further on, you will understand that they are actually all doing the same. They are translating the source IP address when those networks are communicating outbound. We will replace that by the default SNAP policy in order to reduce our amount of rules. So all we need to do in this case, we need to enable it, and it will actually perform the same thing. Whenever there is traffic leaving the firewall on the external interface, which is port 2 in this case, which is port 2 in this case, it will actually perform a masquerading and translate the communication accordingly. So this is how we go. Even though there's a NAT policy in place which allows this translation, there's still a firewall policy needed to forward the communication. So even though you are using any service here in this masquerading rule, it won't allow traffic to communicate unregulated. As indicated by this notification, I will just perform a bulk deletion of the existing policies. You could of course also hide them in case that you want to use them, but you need to reduce the amount of policies overall. In my scenario, those policies are not needed anymore, so I will be able to delete them. Perfect. Now we have reduced the amount of NAT rules to the needed ones. So there's one NAT policy in place that applies to email communication only, as well as one policy that translates all other communication when accessing public networks. So this is a typical use case scenario, as installations mostly require the email communication to be performed via a dedicated IP address. You could, for example, specify an alias IP address here on the WAN interface in order to use a different public IP address, the one where your MX record is pointing to, instead of the normal primary interface IP. In my case, the appliance is not used for email protection, so I do not have to do adjustments. As we now have already adjusted the firewall and NAT rules in order to apply to the XG logic, the next step should be to register the appliance with Sophos Central. I typically suggest to do this early in a project, as Sophos Central not only provides a huge amount of benefits when it comes to the centralized management or performing synchronized security checks, it also offers a centralized backup space where the appliance will be able to store the backup in an encrypted format. You can also perform a single sign-on into the firewall using Sophos Central, so in case a password should be forgotten or lost, a configuration should be lost for some kind of reason, there's always an option to use Sophos Central in order to connect back to your appliance and to fix the issue. So this is what we will be doing next. I move back to the control center. You can, however, also access the registration area via central synchronization. And we can just click here on the security heartbeat widget, which allows us to activate the functionality. So this is actually transferring us over to the central synchronization area, where we can start the registration. So put in a central admin credential ID in order to allow the appliance to be registered. And the system will notify you as soon as the registration has been taken place successfully. Now a registration request is being sent to Sophos Central, which needs to be accepted over there. So I will also connect to Sophos Central. In order to allow the registration process to be completed, so I can afterwards manage the firewall using this. The firewall registration can be viewed in Firewall Management section. And we can see there's our new appliance, which is pending an approval. So this needs to be accepted within Sophos Central so that the appliance is actively allowed to communicate. This now allows us to create a backup schedule for that type of appliance, which I will apply here. So the appliance is now added to the backup schedule, which will create a backup each Saturday on a weekly interval. I would also suggest to generate that backup right away, just in case it should be required. Generate backup. After you have finalized the optimizations later on, you could use this backup here as a template to go back to the default configuration after you completed your optimizations. So let's switch over to the other appliance then. As we now have established a connection to Sophos Central already, we can not only take advantage of the centralized backup management and reporting options, but we can also rely on the security settings provided by Security Heartbeat. As you can see, there is currently already one endpoint connected. The reason for this is that this client system is already actively protected by Sophos. So both the XG firewall as well as the client are managed via the same Sophos Central admin instance and allow an exchange of information between the two systems. Accordingly, we could use now the health status information that is provided by the endpoint in order to react to security changes on that device. This is done within the policies. So let's navigate again to rules and policies. Let's edit our LAN to WAN policy that applies to this client system as well. And let's enable the security heartbeat functionality. At the moment, the system will allow any client to communicate via this policy. If I change the rule like this, the system will only apply this firewall policy in case that the client is able to provide a green heartbeat signal. In case of a malicious event or problem on the endpoint device, you could restrict, for example, internet access or access to important resources. So we are saving it right now. As we now have enabled the security heartbeat for this firewall policy, we receive an indication on the right side which informs us via an icon that there is a security heartbeat requirement to take advantage of this rule. So all security features will be listed here on the right side, so you get an easy overview and verification which security functionalities are applied to which firewall policies. Let's move back to the control center. As mentioned already, on the right side in the security heartbeat widget, we can see the currently connected clients as well as their health status. There's also reporting data available for health status changes, so you will be able to verify once there's a change on the health status. You might also have noticed that there currently is one live user connected, and this information is also provided via the security heartbeat technology. So it's quite an easy way to achieve an authenticated setup. You can see here there's the current username connected to this client, the client type is the heartbeat channel, as well as the client IP address is listed. So I could already start to create user or group-based policies based on this information. Quite a nice way to implement user authentication. The XG firewall, however, supports multiple authentication methods, and those are a little bit different to the UTM appliance or our SG appliance, as we have a fully implemented layer 8 technology in this product. So you can combine and use multiple authentication services, such as NTLM or Kerberos, for example, for web proxy authentication. This is comparable to UTM or SG. It, however, will only be working for the web communication, so traffic being secured via the proxy. On the other hand, there are functionalities like the heartbeat authentication or our so-called STAS agent, which is a piece of software that is deployed on a terminal server or domain controller and is reporting user authentication information to the XG firewall. These functionalities do allow a transparent detection of users and groups and to apply firewall policies to those users or groups accordingly. Let's navigate into the authentication section, where we will find the authentication servers that were migrated from the SG firewall appliance. It is also important to mention that even though the servers can be migrated from an SG firewall, you still need to take care of the group import as well as to decide for which services you would like to use what type of authentication server. So let's first of all test the connection. Authentication server is accessible using that search query and the credentials, so we can start the group import. I'm navigating to the wizard. You have to select the search query in case there are multiple ones assigned in order to browse the Active Directory tree and to select the organizational units that are required here. So I'm importing IT and marketing stuff, and I'm not applying any further specifications here. So this will take care of the group import, which we will find over here in a few seconds. In the meanwhile, let's have a look at the services tabulator, where we can adjust what type of authentication servers we would like to use for what type of functionality. As you can see, for the firewall authentication, I am currently using the Active Directory as well as local users. This is identical for the user portal configuration. However, for the L2TP or IPsec configuration, you might want to use radius authentication, and this can be changed in the services tabulator. Let's check if the groups have already been imported. This is the case, so these are our two Active Directory backend groups which we will be using. Before we are assigning them to the firewall policies, we should verify once more under administration and device access for which areas we have enabled authentication services as well as other services. So let's navigate to Administration Device Access, and let's see. So Active Directory single sign-on is currently not enabled on the LAN zone, which would be a requirement. As I'm not using Chromebook SSO or I'm not using any type of Chromebook, I will disable these functionalities. Same I'm doing for SNMP as well as for the email proxy service. So functionalities which are not used should be disabled. When migrating from SG to XG, you should also verify important parameters within the group. As you can see below here, there are two exclusions which give access to the web admin, and those have been migrated. However, they are not set up very secure, as they will basically allow to connect everyone in the internet to this web interface. So I will be removing this local service ACLs. Now that we have established connection to the authentication servers and verified that setup, as well as we have imported the user groups, we can take advantage of the different groups and apply multiple firewall policies. So let's navigate back to rules and policies in order to create our authenticated policies. So I will just clone this rule above, and I will set it up as an authenticated policy. Here we go. Since we have already imported the user groups earlier, we can just enable the authentication and assign the user groups that we would like to apply with this firewall policy. So from now on, users from the IT department group will be able to use the newly created policy in order to receive a user-based or group-based rule permission. Furthermore, as we have already verified and optimized our firewall, NAT, device access, and authentication server configuration, we should now be starting to tighten our security. This is done by introducing multiple IPS and app control as well as web protection templates in order to assign them to the firewall policies based on the user groups or systems they are protecting. For intrusion prevention and application control, I have already realized those templates via Sophos Central. So let me navigate into the firewall management one more time, where we are applying our XG firewall to the group to which I assigned the templates before. This will trigger a transfer of those templates into the XG firewall. So we need to select Manage Group, as we can assign the firewall system over there. Now that we have performed this task, the task queue is starting to transfer the template configuration that was created earlier. So it will be transferring the intrusion prevention and the application control template, which I afterwards can be assigning in the firewall configuration. While Central Firewall Management is transmitting this configuration changes, let's access our XG firewall in order to create a web protection policy for our IT department. So switching back to the XG, accessing the web protection area, where we can create a new custom policy as well as to edit the existing ones. IT team web access. This proxy profile is operating in a blacklist mode, so everything that is not explicitly forbidden before will be allowed. In this case, we don't want to become too restrictive as it's the IT department, so we are selecting just a bunch of dynamic categories like anonymizers, command and control traffic. However, you can basically specify multiple activities like file type activities, like download of large files, as well as custom URL groups that can be set up. Do not forget to specify the action that should take place on HTTP on HTTPS, as well as do not forget to enable this rule because this happens from time to time. So saving the web protection policy right now in order to navigate then to the firewall policies where we can assign the web protection. So editing the firewall policy that is intended for the IT department. And here we can apply our web protection configuration that was just created before. We should also consider what security checks we would like to perform, like for example malware scanning, verification via our Sandstorm engine, as well as we could make the decision to scan, for example, FTP traffic, which is not handled in this policy. Also, it is possible to block the Google Quick protocol, which performs a fallback on UDP communication. Let's say now we can see that the web protection and antivirus settings have been applied to that. We can also see which policy applies in the web protection configuration. So let's see if the application control and intrusion prevention template has already been transmitted. It is called something with global, exactly, the global app web client filter that I created. So this is the object that was pushed via Sophos Central, and it will block applications with risk level 5 and 4, so the higher risk levels. As this template is in place, also the intrusion prevention template will be in place, and we can assign them in the firewall policies accordingly. Global IPS web template. There we go. So we assign those templates within the firewall policies as well. And as mentioned earlier, you should make sure that you are customizing the different templates in order to apply them either to the system types or user types that should be protected by them. Global app web client and global IPS web access. So now this rule can be considered as being pretty secure. Let's switch back to the presentation and stop with a summary. So let me quickly summarize the activities of today as well as our general recommendations when it comes to SG to XG migration. So we verified and optimized the firewall as well as NAT configuration. We introduced authentication using the imported authentication services, and we selected the service types that we want to apply this authentication for. Also, we adjusted the device access configuration so that we are only providing services on the zones where they are required. We also introduced a connection to Sophos Central in order to take advantage of the security heartbeat functionality, synchronized user IDs, so the heartbeat authentication, as well as the centralized management and backup storage in general. Finally, we created a web protection policy, intrusion prevention and app control policy, which were applied to a particular firewall policy for the IT department users. So I hope this gives you a good structure and guidance for a general progress when it comes to SG to XG migration projects. In regards to the next steps, it's worth mentioning that we have not been able to cover all potential optimization requirements during this session. The appliance hostname, for example, is part of the migration as well and will be transferred from SG to XG. Accordingly, you should verify and check if you have a valid certificate for that in order to assign a proper certificate when accessing the web admin or performing, for example, HTTPS decryption. Furthermore, it might be required to adjust the routing or set up new SD-WAN policies, which is covered more in detail within session number 5. Within session number 8, you will receive a good guidance on the firewall management with Sophos Central